Okay, so today we're going to really dig deep. Deep dive into a thinker whose work just spans so many philosophical areas. I mean, a name that keeps coming up,
Yeah.
really, for anyone trying to get at the core of, well, how our ideas connect to the systems we live in. Georg Lukács.
Lukács, yeah, a fascinating figure. 1885 to 1971, from, literary theory, aesthetics, all the way to being like a founder of Western Marxism and like a forerunner of critical theory. It's a lot.
It is. And for this dive, we're relying heavily on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the entry on Lukács. I mean, it's just so detailed, so comprehensive.
Yeah, it gives you, everything from his early work to all the shifts in his thinking, a real intellectual biography.
It is like a map of his journey. But we're not going to go line by line through it, are we? We want to really pull out what's most juicy for a philosopher, the key idea.
Exactly, like the nuggets of gold, what's going to resonate, what might spark new connections in a philosopher's own thinking.
We're going to be dealing with some really complex stuff. Reification, totality, the whole interplay between form and life.
Right, big ideas. But our aim is to kind of break it down, make it accessible, and most importantly, see how it connects to, the big questions philosophers grapple with.
So where do we even start?
Yeah.
This guy, he wrote so much.
Well, how about his early work? Before he even became a Marxist in 1918. There's a lot there, even then, that's grappling with some foundational philosophical problems.
Especially in aesthetics.
Right.
He's already wrestling with this tension between what he called form and life.
Yeah, exactly. Even back then, he's talking about totality and life, these core concepts for him.
Right. Totality being that sense of interconnectedness. You can't understand any part without the whole. And life being the actual lived experience, all the messiness of it.
Yes. And he saw a perfect unity of those in, the world of Homeric Greece.
It wasn't something imposed, was it? Just naturally there.
Yeah.
The meaning was just woven into the fabric of life itself.
That's it. He argued that in the Homeric world, meaning was immanent. It wasn't some external thing, it wasn't applied from outside. It was just there in experience, a totality of meaning, inseparable from life. But then as history went on, he saw this change. Form started to become external to life. Think social structures, artistic conventions, even our ways of thinking. All these forms becoming separate from that raw, lived experience.
And that, created this dilemma.
Right.
If you reject form, you lose all coherence. But if you impose these rigid external forms, you can crush the essence of life itself.
Exactly. It's this tension between authentic experience and the structures of society, a pretty fundamental philosophical problem.
And one that's very much alive today, right?
Right. And you see Lukács working through this in his early essays, how modernity, takes this problem and makes it even worse. How the tools we use to understand experience, language, categories, social structures, they become these abstractions. They pull us away from the world.
So even before he's a Marxist, he's critiquing the alienating aspects of modern life.
Right. Yes. And he's looking at bourgeois life and art through this lens, drawing on Weber and the idea of rationalization. He saw a move towards asceticism, almost like it's hostile to life. And in art, this art for art's sake movement.
Art retreating from life, becoming this thing unto itself.
Yeah, that's it. He didn't just see that as a style choice, but as a symptom of this deeper fracture.
Yeah.
Society's lost its meaningful life form, so art rejects the emptiness, but ends up cut off, turning inwards.
And then there's this idea of what he calls absolute life, which I find really interesting. It's this genuinely meaningful existence in contrast to the kind of surface level fragmented life that we often experience.
Yeah, empirical life, he called it. And tragedy, for Lukács, becomes this act of rejecting the ordinary in pursuit of that absolute life.
Like a yearning for something more.
Exactly, a very human thing, to want more than the everyday.
And this ethical dimension of form and life, you see it running through his essays on Kierkegaard and on poverty of spirit.
Yeah. He criticizes, rule-based ethics, saying it's alienating. It's another form imposed on life, preventing genuine connection. Instead, he's drawn to this idea of goodness as action, pure action that goes beyond just following rules.
And this all seems to lead to this utopian vision of works as a way to overcome that alienation.
Right. To reach a point where subject and object come together in a genuine community, achieved through self-sacrifice and creative works. A pretty radical proposition.
Really radical. The idea that self-sacrifice through creating can lead to this social harmony. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And you can see how it anticipates his later turn to Marxism. But before that shift, there's this other big influence on him, especially in his aesthetics, neo-Kantianism.
Right. So he's wrestling with form and life, and then he dives into aesthetics, trying to find these like fundamental, almost transcendental conditions for art, all within a neo-Kantian framework.
Yeah.
Lask being a big influence there, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's trying to understand, like, the very possibility of art, right? But the focus shifts to the work of art itself. Not just the artist or the viewer, but the work as the main source of meaning.
Like what makes art art?
Yeah, that's it. And to do this, he draws on neo-Kantian ideas, especially about different spheres of reality.
Like the reality of experience, which is like the raw qualitative stuff of our encounters with the world. How does art communicate meaning across this sphere? Because he believed, if I'm remembering this right, that you couldn't just like directly transmit experience.
That's right. In his 1912 philosophy of art, he makes this point that experience is too detailed, too individual to ever be perfectly communicated. So we have these other modes of communication like logic, ethics, which deal with pure spheres of meaning. But art, it's special. It can't be fully separated from that realm of experience.
Then in his 1916 Aesthetics, he takes this even further. He starts to see the aesthetic sphere as having its own kind of objectivity, like a set of rules that comes from experience itself. So art isn't just reflecting experience, it's actually shaping it.
Exactly. It's got its own internal logic. He's contrasting the messiness of everyday life, that heterogeneity, with the homogeneous form that art achieves.
This order, this unity that art brings to experience.
Right. And this gives aesthetics a unique position, different from logic and ethics, where the line between objective rules and subjective feelings is clearer.
So within this framework, the work of art becomes this ideal unity, a homogeneous unity of form and material, he called it, a concrete totality.
A self-contained world, expressing experience completely.
Like a perfect balance between how it's presented and what's being presented.
Yeah. In the 1912 work, he sees this as encompassing all the parts of an experience, making it truly communicable. But by 1916, it's more about how this unity emerges from experience becoming autonomous, shaping both form and content.
So it's like art gives us this imminent utopia of experience, this vision of experience, all ordered and unified.
Right, an ideal. This maximum objectivity, the subject encountering an object that's perfectly suited to it.
So are you saying all art is utopian?
No, not all art, but the potential is there. He's saying specific artworks are, of course, tied to their historical context, but this potential for totality, this inherent striving for it, those are like timeless conditions, the a priori possibility of art within this neo-Kantian framework.
Okay, so we've got this tension between form and life, and then this dive into art and aesthetics. And then Lukács starts looking at how form changes over time.
Right, he starts analyzing form historically, and he begins with drama, looking at how different genres relate to, like, the big picture worldview of their time. Like tragedy, he says. It arises during periods of social breakdown.
So the form of the art reflects the state of society.
That's what he's arguing in his History of the Modern Drama. Tragedy, with all its conflict and downfall, it tends to flourish when society itself is fragmented.
And then we get the theory of the novel. This is where he really gets into the nitty-gritty of how historical changes and literary genre, especially epic forms, are connected. And again, this idea of totality is front and center.
Exactly. And he contrasts really starkly the Homeric epic with the modern novel. The epic has this closed totality.
Essence is just there, embedded in life. Meaning is unified with individual consciousness.
But the modern world, alienation everywhere, meaningless institutions, totally disconnected from individual experience. It's a big shift.
So like in the ancient world, there's this shared meaning, right?
Yeah.
Even if people don't always consciously grasp it, it's woven into the fabric of things. But then in modern times, meaning becomes this individual quest, internal.
Yeah, and Lukács sees intellectual history reflecting this, moving from epic to tragedy to philosophy, each stage showing this increasing externality of meaning, these separate transcendental loci, he calls them.
And what drives this? Why this movement away from totality?
Because that inherent connection between life and essence, it's eroded. You get this sense of transcendental homelessness, like we're cut adrift, and our stance towards the world becomes more normative, more prescriptive.
Like we have to impose meaning because it's not just there anymore.
Right. Institutions become just empty conventions, this external second nature, divorced from any real meaning. And then the novel emerges.
The novel is the form fit for this fragmented world.
For Lukács, yes, it's the epic form that responds to this loss. The characters, they're always searching for meaning in a world that doesn't easily provide it.
But even in that, isn't there this, like, glimmer of hope? That yearning for meaning hasn't vanished.
Exactly. The novel itself, in its form, it's striving for resolution. It suggests that desire for totality is still there.
And then, bam, Lukács becomes a communist.
1918, yeah, huge shift. And he starts trying to bring these Marxist ideas into his earlier ethical concerns. You see this in his essay, Bolshevism as an Ethical Problem.
He even saw this tragic necessity in revolutionary politics, which is fascinating.
It's complex. That early engagement with Marxism, it's so tied to his earlier philosophical work. He saw building a classless society as, like, a moral imperative.
Like a utopian ethical vision.
Yeah. And he's grappling with this question, how do you achieve a good outcome, a morally desirable one, when the means might be ethically messy?
Revolution in all its complexity.
Exactly. But then comes 1923. And history and class consciousness. This is where things get really interesting, especially for philosophers.
This is where he lays out his theory of reification, right? In that famous essay, Reification in the Consciousness of the Proletariat. I mean, this is like foundational for Western Marxism, critical theory, the whole thing.
Huge. And it all builds on Marx's idea of commodity fetishism.
Which is like this idea that under capitalism, social relations start to look like they're just properties of things.
Right. Like the value of a commodity, it appears as if it's inherent to the thing itself rather than the result of social relations.
And Lukács takes this idea and, like, explodes it.
Yeah.
He's saying the commodity form doesn't just distort how we see economics, it becomes the dominant form of objectivity itself.
It's the underlying structure shaping our whole reality. And he connects this back to his neo-Kantian stuff, saying these forms aren't timeless categories of the mind, but they're socially constructed, historically specific.
So, like, our understanding of what's objective, what's real, it's all shaped by this commodity form.
Exactly. He's drawing on that Kantian idea that we experience objects through these organizing forms or categories. But Lukács is historicizing them. In capitalist societies, he says, the commodity form becomes the primary way we perceive the world, both objectively and subjectively.
And he really breaks it down, right? Both the objective and subjective dimensions of reification. Objectively, you've got this increasing rationalization and fragmentation of labor. Work loses its meaning. It becomes just a series of abstract, quantifiable tasks.
Yeah. And then subjectively, this leads to a fragmentation of experience. People become passive, contemplative. They start to see themselves and others as, like, just objects, just commodities.
So it's not just our work, it's our whole way of being in the world that becomes reified.
Absolutely. And this famous quote of his where he says, the commodity form, it stamps its imprint upon the whole consciousness of man. Like, everything becomes a thing to be bought and sold.
Even our relationships, our qualities. It's a pretty bleak picture.
It is. That reification, it severs the meaning of our actions from our own self-understanding. It becomes this external force that governs us.
Alien and oppressive.
Yeah, and it's important to note, this theory had a massive impact. You see it in the Frankfurt School. Even thinkers like Lucien Goldman interpreting Heidegger through the lens of reification.
And this commodity form, it doesn't stay contained in economics, does it? It bleeds into everything. Politics, law, the whole 9 yards.
It permeates everything. You get the rise of bureaucracies, abstract legal systems. They all prioritize efficiency, abstract rules over human needs, lived experience.
But this whole process of rationalization, it can never really grasp the totality, can it?
Mm-hmm.
Because it excludes all the methy, irrational, qualitative parts of life.
Yeah.
So isn't this just a Marxist version of that earlier tension between form and life?
That's a great point. The rigid forms of capitalist rationality, they can't capture the dynamism of social life.
Like they're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. And this is, for Lukács, what's at the root of those classic antinomies of bourgeois thought. All those big philosophical problems like the subject-object dualism.
Like, how can we know the thing in itself, like Kant talked about?
Yeah. Lukács is saying these aren't just limitations of human reason. They're reflections of a society structured by reification.
So the way we think is shaped by these deeper social structures.
Right. And he sees Fichte with his identical subject-object as a step in the right direction, but still too individualistic.
Fichte recognizes the subject's active role in shaping reality, but doesn't quite get there.
Yeah. But then there's Hegel, who recognized this totality of concrete history as a kind of collective subject, the we, that drives historical development.
So Hegel's getting closer, but he still ends up stuck in idealism, right?
Right, with the whole world spirit idea. And for Lukács, it's Marx who finally provides the answer.
By identifying the proletariat as the real subject-object of history. Not just an oppressed class, but the force that can overcome reification and transform society.
The revolutionary class,
Yeah.
the ones who can break free from these contradictions.
And this is where his idea of standpoint theory comes in, right? The proletariat has this unique perspective, this epistemic advantage, because they're the ones who experience reification most directly.
Exactly. He's an early defender of standpoint theory. He argues that both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat live within this reified reality, but the proletariat has a unique capacity to see through it.
But is it just about having different experiences? Because there's a lot of debate about, like, where this advantage comes from.
Right. Some people say it's just the lived experience of being a worker, but others, and this is where more recent interpretations lean, emphasize this bifurcated consciousness.
They experience the contradictions of capitalism more directly.
Yeah. It's not that they have different observations necessarily. It's this inherent conflict in their position. They're both active agents in production and passive objects of exploitation. This pushes them to develop a more critical, more holistic understanding.
So they can't just accept the way things appear on the surface.
Exactly. But this potential, it doesn't automatically become knowledge. It takes collective action. The proletariat has to recognize itself as the creator of social reality.
They have to become aware of themselves as the subject-object of history.
And that's what can break down those reified structures. It's a collective awakening, a realization of their own power.
So overcoming reification isn't just an intellectual thing, it's a practical thing. It's the communist revolution itself.
Exactly. He knew there were questions about whether you could ever completely overcome reification, but the struggle, that was the essential thing.
The constant pushing back against these forces.
Right. And another tricky point there is this distinction between empirical class consciousness, like the immediate awareness of your situation, and imputed class consciousness, which is more like an understanding of your historical role. And the role of the Communist Party in all of this, that was a complex issue for Lukács, something he kept wrestling with.
And running through all of this is this, like, huge Hegelian influence.
Oh, absolutely. He was really insistent that Marxist methodology wasn't about economic determinism, as some people thought. It was about Marx's dialectics, this point of view of totality.
Seeing the whole picture.
Yeah, and in his social ontology, practice, and specifically political action, that takes center stage. It's the primary way to overcome reification. He's not just talking about labor here, it's about political struggle.
So changing the world, not just interpreting it.
That's it. And he sees historical processes, the totality, as the foundation of objective reality, which means he's pretty critical of more contemplative epistemologies.
Like just sitting back and observing.
Right. And he even has problems with Engels' emphasis on the experimental method. He sees it as too focused on just mirroring reality.
So we have to be actively engaged in shaping the world, not just trying to passively understand it.
Right. And this leads him to critique all forms of institutional rationalization as alienating. But this also creates problems because it makes it hard to see how there can be any positive developments within the division of labor, the specialization of different spheres.
Because he's so focused on this unified totality.
Exactly. The focus on unity makes it harder to appreciate the potential for good things to come out of differentiation.
So History and Class Consciousness, even though it's this hugely influential book, it also gets criticized, especially for its idealism. And even Lukács himself later revises his views.
Right. In the 1967 preface to the new edition, he talks about this confusion between objectification, externalization, and alienation.
Yeah, for a guy who really cared about being precise, that's a big deal.
It is. And, the book was initially celebrated by many on the left, but the party orthodoxy ended up condemning it. They saw it as straying too far from a materialist interpretation of Marxism.
Too philosophical, not practical enough.
Something like that. But Lukács himself also recognized problems. He said the book muddled these three things: objectification, which he came to see as necessary for self-consciousness, externalization, and alienation, which was the real problem.
So we need to objectify the world, to engage with it, to become self-aware. But that doesn't necessarily mean alienation.
Right. And this distinction is huge for his later work. It means you can critique reification without saying we need to get rid of all objectivity. You can have a more nuanced view of political practice.
It becomes more of a back and forth, right? Human agency pushing back against these structures, but also being shaped by them.
Yeah, a dialectical relationship. And this leads him back to Hegel, who he still saw as like the closest bourgeois thinker to really grappling with reification because of Hegel's focus on the subject-object process.
Hegel saw this dynamic interplay, this back and forth.
Right. And Lukács still believed that Marxism was like the completion of Hegel's project, but in a critical way, of course.
Building on him, but going beyond him. And he wrote a whole book about this, The Young Hegel, exploring how Hegel's engagement with British political economists actually shaped his idea of dialectics and historical progress.
Yeah, contrasting that early, more objectivist Hegel with his later, more abstract, more focused on logic.
So even though he was critical, he saw a lot of value in Hegel. But then there's this more difficult period in Lukács's work where he becomes very polemical.
Yeah, from the 1930s through the 50s, he sets up this really sharp division between Marxist dialectics and everything else, which he labels bourgeois irrationalism.
Like everything that's not Marxist is irrational.
Pretty much. And this comes out in his big book, The Destruction of Reason, where he's basically saying that all these post-Hegelian thinkers, Schelling, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, they all paved the way for Nazism. It's a very sweeping, very controversial claim.
Not his most subtle work.
Definitely not. But even during this time, he's still developing his philosophical system. He comes up with this ontology of social being. It's got 3 levels: material, organic, and social reality.
At each level, it's all about this tension between essence and appearance, right?
Yeah.
Working itself out through history.
Yeah. That emphasis on historicity, that's still central for him.
Always with the history.
Right. And his theory of social reality is really interesting. It's all about this idea of teleological positing through labor. Basically, how we introduce norms and values into the world through our actions.
So it's not just about the material stuff, it's about the meaning we give to things.
Exactly. And that's the foundation of his later theory of alienation in the ontology. It's this idea that alienation happens when we can't fully participate in species being in the totality of social life.
Because the structures we've created prevent us from being fully human.
Right. And this points towards an ethical ideal where social relations allow everyone to participate fully.
A society that actually enables human flourishing.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah.
And this all feeds back into his later aesthetics, which are, well, they're pretty complex. But the basic idea is that art is a kind of reflection, Widerspiegelungen, of objective reality, but different from scientific reflection.
It's got that human element, right?
Right. It's anthropomorphic. It has this immediate impact on experience. And it can represent universal essences through particular works, through Besonderheit.
So art can give us this glimpse of the universal through the particular.
Yeah. And he talks about the function of art as like showing us the totality within this homogeneous medium, this unified artwork, leading to what he calls defetishization, like stripping away illusions and catharsis.
So it's not just about beauty, it's about revealing something true about the world.
Right. And he also brings in this idea of mimesis, this basic human way of coping with the world through imitation. But art, it's conscious reflection, not just blind imitation.
So it's like taking that natural human impulse and elevating it, making it more deliberate.
Yeah. And all of this connects back to his famous defense of realism.
Yeah.
And his criticisms of avant-garde movements.
Which got him into a lot of trouble.
Oh, yeah. But it all comes back to that same philosophical drive, this desire to bridge the gap between human life and objective social forms.
To find a way to make those two things connect in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And that's what makes Lukács so interesting for philosophers. His work, it just touches on so many key issues.
The relationship between form and life, the critique of modernity, reification, the whole legacy of Hegel and Marx. It's a lot to take in.
It is, and his work is still so relevant today because those questions about social structures, subjectivity, objectivity, the possibility of social transformation, they're not going away.
No, they're not. And Lukács, he gives us this really rich, really complex way of thinking about them.
He does, and for anyone who really wants to dig in, reading Lukács directly is a must. Start with the theory of the novel, maybe some selections from history and class consciousness.
Yeah, those are good starting points. And of course, the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry is like a roadmap.
Definitely. It'll help you find your way through all the twists and turns of his thought.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. A real deep dive into Lukács.
We have.
So, for our listeners, the philosophers out there, the big question that Lukács leaves us with is this. How do we bridge that gap between individual experience and these huge systemic forces? And how can his idea of totality, which changes so much throughout his work, help us think about these debates about holism versus reductionism. Those are the questions to ponder.
Big questions, and definitely worth pondering.
So until our next exploration, keep those philosophical gears turning.